Well, welcome to the last series of lectures in our zoology class. These, as you can see, are going to be all about reproductive biology. It's a subject that is so very, very important for all organisms because passing along information and genetics to the next generation is what's going to ensure that the species survives. In fact, if we go back to think about evolutionary biology, we said that what's going on is that we are talking about some members of a species who are more likely to survive and then reproduce. So the reproductive part is an essential measurement, really, of how evolution is going to cause change over many generations. Yeah, so this is a really important subject, and we want to get to it. We're going to end this whole series by taking a look a little bit at human reproductive biology and consider just a little bit of human reproductive biology. But of course, this fall in my human reproductive biology course, it's a 2-hour course, we've already talked about it. It's BI201. If there are non-majors that are interested in taking it, I welcome them, then we would hope that they had already had at least general biology before that, which is a prerequisite really for the course. Because in the course we're going to talk about biology and hope that that course, reproductive biology, is not the first course. All right, let's talk now about zoology, reproductive biology. In the whole field of zoology, we find two main types of reproduction, sexual and asexual. Now, we already talked about asexual reproduction when we looked at cnidarians, when we looked at some sponges. We even saw in planarians that we could cut them in half and that through regeneration we could get more animals. That's asexual reproduction. It's what an individual can do by itself. As you probably are well aware, in sexual reproduction there are two different types, a male and a female, and they make different kinds of cells, eggs and sperm, and those unite at fertilization to then create a new individual. What we see in a most unusual situation is aphids that right now at this time of the year are doing very well. They're going to be doing very well anyway on all those new leaves that are coming out on the trees. So right now, if you go outside and you enjoy the outdoors, and I hope you do, you'll see that there are all sorts of plants that are budding, they're flowering, and they're creating lots of leaves. And one of the reasons that I really love the months of April and May is that when those new leaves come back out, and that green makes me happy, and I think about wonderful summers up ahead. But also those new leaves are in really good condition. I don't know if you ever think about it, but they look really, really good. And then after the aphids and the caterpillars and all kinds of other things have their whack at the leaves, then right about August or so, those leaves have holes in them, or they might have their edges trimmed up. So what's happening right now is the plant world is coming into a real period of growth, lots of generation of new parts, and then, of course, in the field of biology, there's going to be something that's going to eat those parts. Well, aphids right now are going to be proliferating asexually because, boy, oh boy, is this a good time. And so these forms right here that are asexual are going to grow, and then they'll reproduce asexually, and then their babies will grow, and the populations of aphids will be going up tremendously from now until pretty much the end of the summer, about August or September. Then what's interesting is, as the weather turns cold and leaves start dropping on some plants, like oak trees, then we see a sudden switch, and some of the eggs that are laid by the asexual aphids right here actually will develop differently into either females or males, okay? And then in the fall, those females and the males that you see here with some wings, there are differences in different kinds of aphid species. These two sexes then will find each other and reproduce sexually, and they will lay down eggs that will survive the winter and then will emerge in the spring. So there's a switch, there's an alteration between asexual and sexual reproduction. We're going to keep looking at this one figure. This is not from your textbook. So what we're seeing at the time when we see the switch is that stress of some kind, which really means, stress is really meaning that for whatever reason and in whatever way, things aren't so good. So you might be stressed by not having water available and getting really thirsty. You might be stressed by it being too cold or too warm. You could be stressed because you're in a hostile situation with maybe wild animals that threaten you, or other human beings that threaten you. That's stressful. You could be stressed because there's disease, because there's some kind of disease that's going around. And of course, the COVID virus is what we worry about. Nonetheless, what particular stress it is here right now is something that we haven't determined. So here are a couple things that could be stress. That is that the aphids ate all the plant. There's some kind of natural disaster like a storm or a fire or a tornado. Or really cold temperatures. You can barely see that right now. But really cold temperatures, which is what tends to happen in the fall. So the question is, so I've got listed those same things right down here below. The question is, why are aphids switching from asexual to sexual reproduction at a time of stress? What are the advantages of each form of reproduction? So, if we were in class, I would ask you to turn to the people around you and to discuss this. But I'd like you to really consider what's going on with asexual reproduction. Why is it beneficial to reproduce asexually when the going is great, but then to reproduce sexually when the going is not so great? So you have to think about what are the advantages of both sexual and asexual reproduction. So let's talk about asexual reproduction first. What are the advantages there? Well, if you think about it, maybe in terms of fast food, if a fast food chain is doing really well because whatever it is they're selling is really, really popular, then they probably just ought to keep doing what they're doing and keep selling whatever it is that's popular. Ford, Chrysler, still make trucks. Jeeps make Jeeps, right? There are certain kinds of products that that company is known for. Nike is pretty much making shoes, okay? Maybe there's other things, clothing and stuff that they do. So the argument is here in asexual reproduction, if whatever you're doing right now and in the conditions are pretty good, then just keep doing it because you're passing along all of your genetics when you reproduce in this form. So you're making more of yourself. And if the going's great, then great, make more of yourself so that in the future, when it gets bad, then it's like buying lottery tickets. You have a better chance of at least some of your offspring that are going to persist for a year from now. But then what's going on with the time of stress? Well, first of all, notice that these little guys don't have wings. And down here in the sexual forms, we see wings, here indicated only for the males. I don't know if that's always true for aphids, but these sexual stages are known for being winged. Okay, so what do you get at a time of stress by switching? Well, you get a change in body form. That's one thing to write down. And can you think of any advantage to having wings versus not having wings? So in a time of stress, for example, you killed the plant you're on because there's so many of your babies eating up the plant, or your particular area has been destroyed by a storm or a fire, whatever, or that there's really, really cold temperatures. Well, in the first two right here, moving might take you out of the place that's being stressed. So a sexual form like this might allow you to relocate to a place where things are better. The depletion of resources, so if you've just pretty much wiped out the tree or the group of plants in your field or that part of the field, then maybe flight will take you to a more successful area. Same thing is true if there's a storm or a fire. Cold, not so much. But what else do you benefit by switching to sexual versus asexual reproduction? That's what I want to talk about a little bit more. Advantages and disadvantages. The disadvantage of sexual reproduction is that you switch. Now, in asexual reproduction, you're passing along all of your genetics. So asexual reproduction is cloning. Okay? So if we took all the genetic material from one of your muscle cells and somehow we're able to implant that into an embryo, or actually it's a fertilized egg, we could make a biological clone of yourself. Now, it wouldn't have your knowledge and probably most of your habits and the things you do, but it would have most of your traits. It would look like your twin. And maybe you've known twins before, and you know that in human identical twins, you can still tell differences between them. Now, there may be scars and tattoos that already are easy ways. They may choose to dress in different ways or have hairstyles in different ways. But if you simply looked at twin adult human beings who are maybe in the 30s or 40s, there's usually pretty clear differences between them. And that's because they share all of their genetics. Now, when we reproduce sexually, you're only passing along half of your genetics. Because right now, in a man and a woman having children, man's passing along half, woman, the wife, is passing, or whatever, the mate, is passing along half. And then together, half and a half makes a whole, so the baby now has a complete genetic code. So that's what I mean by you're passing on only half of your genetics if you're reproducing sexually. The second problem is you have to find a mate. And that certainly wasn't true when you're reproducing by yourself. If you're just cloning yourself, if you're just budding off or reproducing asexually like these aphids are doing. The next thing is when you need to find a mate, you may spend a lot of time trying to find a mate, but you also may spend a lot of energy. You might be moving around a lot looking for a mate, and you may have to have special displays, special coloration that we talked about. Growing parts, maybe antlers or something that's going to be attractive. And finally, in most sexual reproduction, males produce a surplus of sperm. And so you're going to make a lot of sperm and yet not use it. And we think that this is a strategy actually within sexual reproduction where males who invest the least typically, they don't want to be short of sperm when there's an opportunity to mate. So it's better to always have plenty of sperm just in case you get a chance to mate. Well, what are the advantages? We said that these aphids are switching from asexual reproduction to sexual reproduction. So here's where we're going to consider, well, what could be the benefit? Why has this been favored, right? They aren't plotting this, they aren't thinking it. We often think about evolution and we phrase it in ways that it looks like it's clever, or why are they doing this? The answer is they're doing it because those that did it were more likely to survive and reproduce. They didn't have any committee to decide solutions. They had lots of different options, and what we see, a switch to sexual reproduction, has been more successful than just sticking with asexual. So what are the advantages? And here's the biggie. What you get out of sex is genetic diversity. You get a recombination of traits, okay? So the question is, why is diversity worth the cost? You give up passing along half of your genetics. Boy, oh boy, diversity must be important. And then the next question is, why diversity in a time of stress? So if we really think about this, and the bottom line is that if the going gets tough, if it becomes difficult to survive, with whatever you currently have, well, then you might not want to keep on doing the same thing. So back to that fast food restaurant. If the place is selling burgers and they're doing really well and they're selling more and more burgers and they're doing the same thing, and now all of a sudden the environment changes. Maybe it's because there's a lot of competition. Maybe it's because people don't really want to eat burgers anymore. And so diversity comes along. And in a fast food restaurant establishment, they'll change up the menu. They'll add new things. McDonald's, we've talked about before, one of the oldest franchises that have been around, now coming up on 60 years. McDonald's has changed their menu. Why? Well, we said because they had competition or because the consumer wanted something else. They wanted salads or they wanted fish or all the other things, McRib, all the other things that they've been doing. So when whatever you're doing in asexual reproduction now doesn't seem to be very successful, then you have to give up something, my goodness, half of your genetics, but that's better than none. And that's really the point. If what you're doing now simply won't do it in the future, then better to only pass along half your genetics than none. That's the argument. Okay? That's why it's worth the cost. Why in a time of stress? Because it's another way to do something, and when you have a lot of diversity, then you hope at least one of these is going to work out. So the question now is, how does sexual reproduction within animals generate diversity? And the answer is that when we look at the mixture of the male and female genetics that are getting passed along, it's new combinations of traits. New combinations of traits from dad and mom, plus dad may bring to the situation new traits, new alleles. Alleles are versions of genes. So dad may bring in some trait that mom didn't have. So the mixing together of two lineages like that, two individuals mixing together, has a chance of something new. And second, it's just like shuffling cards. You shuffle the cards and then you deal them out. And when you deal them out, so if we're talking about maybe blackjack or poker, it's the combination of cards that really matters. Okay? So in sex, we produce a lot of babies, and in sex, the babies are not exactly like each other. There are differences. And what we're saying is, in a time of stress, maybe some of those babies will be better suited for that environment than other babies. We're trying lots of different things and hope something works. That's the bottom line. Now, how does sex actually produce diversity? Well, I'm not sure where you might have gotten this, but it turns out when I think about my students over the last 30 years in zoology, very few students are remembering at least these lessons if they had them in the past. The very first way, so we're going to look at different ways that we generate diversity. I remind you that you have a lecture outline, and I hope you have that with you. Maybe this is a good place to pause and find that lecture outline and follow along, okay? So the first thing we're going to consider is independent assortment, and we're going to use humans as an example. Now, I hope most of you know that in your cells, you typically have 23 pairs of chromosomes. There are a few cases where there's an exception, and one is where you're making eggs or sperm. Those don't have 23 pairs. They probably have 23 chromosomes, but they're not in pairs. Another exception is in red blood cells in your circulation. There shouldn't be nuclei. Those cells lost their nuclei. So there are exceptions, but the vast majority of the cells in your body have 23 pairs of chromosomes. But we said, of those pairs, we said you only donate half of your genetics. And the way you donate half of your genetics is that you give up in an egg or in a sperm one member of each of the 23 pairs. Okay? So we said we have 23 pairs of chromosomes, and in the first step here, you're going to give up one member, so your child will get one of your chromosomes in the pair. So how do we sort this out? How do we actually divide this, right? So you might have 23 pairs of shoes. That would be a lot, and I'd really wonder why you needed 23 pairs of shoes. But let's say you have 23 pairs of altogether different kinds of shoes. Okay? We could even toss in some sandals if you wanted to. Okay, so tennis shoes, dress shoes, sandals, flip-flops, whatever works for you. All right. What we're saying is, of your 23 pairs of all these different kinds of shoes, you give up one of the shoes from each pair. And that's what you're passing along in an egg or a sperm. Now, what process does this sorting? Well, I hope you know the answer is meiosis. And which chromosome is donated from each pair turns out is random. So, think about your pairs of shoes, and for each pair of whatever you got on your feet, you got a left one and you have a right one, right? So what we're really saying is, in all of this, are you giving up from in each individual pair, are you giving up the left shoe or the right shoe, okay? So we're going to do this analogy with shoes. So here, now it's kind of an older picture. These are some really old shoes of mine. But over here is the left shoe and the right shoe. And just so you can keep track, here this one looks different from this one. And they both look like I've been using them to mow the yard. And I probably have. So in each of the 23 pairs of chromosomes, am I going to give up the left one or the right one? Now, just to help you out here, out of 23 pairs, you might give up the left shoe all the time. And so you're going to pass along in an egg or a sperm, in this analogy, all 23 left shoes. Now, another way to do this would be to pass along all the right shoes, right? Okay, good. So far we've said when you're sorting out which member of each of 23 pairs of chromosomes, 23 pairs of shoes, when we're sorting out, well, which one of these are we going to pass along? We found there's at least two different ways you could do it, right? The left shoe all the time or the right shoe all the time. Yeah, but what if in the first pair of chromosomes is the left shoe, and then in all the other pairs of chromosomes is the right shoe? Okay. Or what if it's alternating? That in the chromosomes, the first, third, fifth, seventh, ninth, etc., they're going to be the left. And then in the second, fourth pair, sixth pair, etc., it's going to be the right. Well, it turns out, here's figure 11e, showing you how we're taking pairs of chromosomes. Here's a pair of chromosomes. Here they've duplicated themselves, so they haven't separated right here. So these are said to be sister chromatids. So this is a single, this is what you have in your cells. These are cells that have copied the DNA, but it's still stuck there in the middle. So these guys look more like X's, kind of compressed X's. Here they're spread out a little bit. So this is that same pair, but now this one DNA molecule with its proteins. We got two DNA molecules here right now, but they're still connected in the middle. Okay? And the question is, when we're on this side going to make some cells, or this side, what are we going to give up? Are we going to give up this one, or are we going to give up this one? And I'm showing you that different cells get different things. So this cell got the blue member, the blue shoe, and this side got the red shoe. And then what's going to happen in the process of meiosis is that then we'll split that chromosome here. We'll split the sister chromatids. And now, see, sister chromatids separate. And now we get 4 cells. But you can see that 2 cells got the blue side and 2 cells got the red side. Okay, we're sorting that all out. And here's what's going on. So this is all happening in meiosis, and here's the figure for you, 4611. Here, interestingly, is a difference between males and females, and especially in regards to humans, but this is generally true in zoology. Here in the production of sperm, we start out with a single 2N cell. That means they have 2 of every kind of chromosome. And eventually we wind up with 4 separate functional sperm. In females, it turns out it's a little bit different. Females start out with this 2N right here, but after the first division, you get 1 good egg of the normal number, and then there's just this little cast-off that has the other nucleus. It's called a polar body. And that polar body is discarded. And so then this egg, developing egg, undergoes meiosis again. It gives off another polar body. And so the product of meiosis in females is just 1 egg that has half the genetics of the original cell, because they get rid of the extra nucleus, the little polar body. Now this one could actually divide again, making then 2 up here plus 1 more is 3. 3 plus 1 is 4. So this one could be dividing again. And that is still the 4 cells, but we'd be producing 3 polar bodies and 1 functioning egg. Okay? And in this situation, it's kind of funny because there's a funny phrase here. We talk about putting all our eggs in 1 basket. Well, here is putting all the nucleus in 1 egg. All the nucleus, all the cytoplasmic material, sorry. Ultimately, the 1 nucleus that we're going to use is in 1 egg, but all that cytoplasm is pretty much conserved. So the polar bodies are coming off just for the purpose of producing 1 egg with as much cytoplasm conserved all in 1 cell. And that cytoplasm is where there's a lot of storage of materials that's going to help the future embryo. So the product of meiosis in females is just 1 functional gamete, 1 functional germ cell, which is an egg. I'm going to go back. The product in males is 1 cell makes 4 functioning, 4 sperm. Okay? Now in females, we're saying that those 3 extra nuclei are just thrown away as polar bodies. Okay. All right. Now we're seeing the recombination of the nuclei, of course, from an oocyte and from a sperm, got a fertilized egg. It turns out that that second polar body may not come off until after fertilization. It's just kind of a weird thing. But the point is, we're taking a 1N gamete and we're merging it with another 1N cell, and we wind up down here. Well, there's the nucleus, 1N there, 1N there, and then it'll be 2N. Okay. All right. Now let's step back and think about this a little bit. We were talking about meiosis, sorting out chromosomes into eggs and sperm, and we were saying that in that process, so go back to those 23 pairs of shoes. Are you giving up the left shoe all the time, the right shoe all the time, or some combination? And I said, well, if you made a sperm just from all the left, that would be one kind of sperm. And if you made a sperm just from all the ones on the right, well, that'd be a second type of sorting. But we said also the first shoe could be the left and the other 22 the right, or any other combination. Well, when you're picking the left or the right shoe from 23 pairs of shoes, or picking one chromosome from 23 pairs of chromosomes, how many different possible sperm or how many different possible eggs could you produce? And the answer is 2 to the 23rd. 2 to the 23rd is 8,388,608. By independent assortment, which is this first thing we're still talking about, by independent assortment, you can produce this many different eggs and this many different sperm. And when you combine this many different eggs with this many different sperm, how many different babies can you produce? How many different offspring can you produce? So if dad's producing this many different sperm and mom's producing this many different eggs, holy cow, how many different kinds of babies just because of independent assortment. How many different kinds of babies can you produce? Well, it turns out in most textbooks, what the authors have done is rounded this number to just 8 million instead of 8,388,000. And so 8 million times 8 million is 64 trillion. But this is the actual number. And if you take this number times this number, the answer is 70 trillion. And so in some cases, with the authors that I work with, I've pointed out that if you just use the round 8 million versus the real number, you're going to generate 64 trillion possibilities when the real number is 70 trillion. Okay, what's the difference between 70 trillion and 64 trillion? Well, it's $6 trillion. Okay? Holy cow. All right, so what's $1 million bucks? All right, what's a billion? A billion is 1,000 million. Okay, so if you had $1 billion, you could spend about $3 million a day for a year. Okay. So a billion is 1,000 million. What's a trillion? It's a million million. Holy cow. And the difference between the 64 trillion and 70 trillion is 6 trillion. All right. So now we're thinking about 70 trillion. Okay. That's how many different kinds of babies just because of independent assortment you can produce. All right, now we're really going to step back. What's your point? Well, the point was, we said on these aphids, oh yeah, remember the aphids? On these aphids, what they were doing is switching to sexual reproduction so that they can generate diversity. I don't know how many chromosomes they have, but if they were like humans, then instead of producing the same baby by asexual reproduction, well, holy cow, now they can produce 70 trillion different kinds of babies. So all your life, I hope, people have been telling you that you're special. Okay? Maybe that's been at a really important time, or maybe that's been a time when you're feeling kind of bad. Well, folks, if mom and dad tried to produce another one of you, they'd have to have 70 trillion kids in order to be sure that they produced another one of you. And that is only because of independent assortment. That's what we're still on. That's which of these chromosomes you pass along. Pretty amazing. Turns out it's even bigger than that. It's even bigger than this. And here's why. So how does sex produce diversity? Independent assortment, which is which member of which chromosome pair gets passed along. But there's another way that we generate diversity. It's called crossing over. We said that, are you giving up the left shoe or the right shoe? Now the question is, of the chromosomes that you inherited, okay, are you giving up the one you might have inherited from your mom or the one you might have inherited from your dad? Okay, so for each pair of chromosomes, one of those chromosomes came from dad, one came from mom. Okay, if it's the sex chromosomes, if you remember how this works, for a guy, for example, so mom is only going to have XX sex chromosomes because women are XX typically. Males are XY. So if mom and dad give rise to a baby boy, that boy got an X from mom, and that boy got a Y from dad. And so that's the XY, okay? Now, in all the other chromosomes, you get one from mom and one from dad. That's what we've been talking about with independent assortment. But it turns out that you don't pass along the exact same chromosomes that you inherited. You got a chromosome from mom, chromosome from dad for each pair. before you pass along one of your two chromosomes for each pair. Again, in my analogy, this was like the left or the right shoe. Before you pass along that left or right shoe, there's actually an exchange of genetics between the two. And this is to say that you don't pass along just your left shoe or just your right shoe. They exchange parts before they get passed along. Okay? And that's what crossing over is all about. On average, there's about 2 segments in each chromosome that get exchanged. Where this occurs is almost completely random. There are a couple places that are a little less likely. And this adds tremendous diversity, as you can see, to the 70 trillion. So here's a picture. This is, I think, figure 1312 in your book that's showing you that the chromosomes right here, so this is the one you got from your dad, this is the one you got from your mom. I was saying that you don't pass along just the chromosomes that you inherited. Instead, there's an exchange. And so here's the one you got from dad. And remember, this is a replicated chromosome. So these are 2 sister chromatids right here. These are sister chromatids here. And what they're doing, it looks like some kind of dance, is they're actually crossing over, quite literally, and they're exchanging. So it's like exchanging socks, if you want to think about it that way. So the sock from this guy gets exchanged with the sock over here from this guy. Sometimes I think about it as exchanging shoelaces. That's kind of a bit of a crossing over. Now here they're showing only 1 crossing over, and we said on average there's about 2. So not just here in having some fun here, like socks, but then maybe also gloves that they're going to exchange. So the point is that when these chromosomes then get passed along, you're not passing along what you inherited, because you inherited just all this dark one or the lighter colored one here. What you're passing along is actually a combination of what you inherited from mom and from dad. And that generates even more diversity. So here's another way to think about swapping, crossing over, the swapping of segments. Think about editing films, okay? So let's say we got 2 famous movies. One's going to involve a big green guy called Shrek, and the other one might involve Harry Potter, okay? What if we swapped the 5th minute? So now you're watching the film, you're 4 minutes into Shrek, you're 4 minutes into Harry Potter, and then all of a sudden, if you're watching Shrek, after 4 minutes, then you get 1 minute of Harry Potter. You actually get the 5th minute of Harry Potter in the middle of your Shrek movie. After that 5th minute, then it goes back to playing Shrek. And you're probably going to be scratching your head and wondering, what the heck just happened? Over here in Harry Potter, you're watching Harry Potter, you're all excited, you're 4 minutes in, you're settling in your seat, you're eating some popcorn maybe, and all of a sudden you start watching Shrek for a minute. And then it goes away. Now, when we get to minute 6, it goes back to Harry Potter. That's what crossing over is like. So, here we're looking again. Meiosis, what's going on? Here is a single pair of chromosomes that have already replicated their DNA, but it hasn't separated yet. So this is sister chromatids on this one blue chromosome, and sister chromatids on this one red. So this is the one pair of chromosomes, and here they're crossing over. So there's crossed over parts, and so what you wind up going to the future cells, there's going to be one cell here, and there's going to be another cell over here. What you have going over here are not just blue chromosomes and red chromosomes, but combinations. It's more colorful, which actually is another way of saying there's more diversity. There's more diversity. And that's what our point's been all along. How do we generate diversity? So it turns out that for humans, between independent assortment and crossing over, the diversity that's generated is so large, we can't even come close to imagining. Now, we said just by independent assortment, mom and dad could produce 70 trillion types of genetic kids. But what is that when you add crossing over? And the number, it doesn't matter, is beyond anything that you could come close to imagining. The answer is probably 70 trillion squared, which is just so many zeros, it's hard to believe. Okay? Trying to help you out to understand these large numbers. Here's how many seconds there are in a year. 31 million seconds in a year. Okay? How many seconds in 100 years? So let's say you get to be 100 years old. How many seconds did you live through? And the answer is 3 billion, a little bit more than 3 billion seconds in 100 years. And we're talking about 70 trillion here. Okay? In 20,000 years, you'd be at 63 trillion seconds. In your whole body, there's probably about 50 trillion cells. The United States is taking out loans. That's what the national debt is. The national debt is just like you and me, in which we take out a loan to buy a car, or to buy a house, or to buy whatever it is, student loans to go to college. You owe that money, okay? We're taking out a loan. That's what the national debt is. Right now, in the middle of this horrible, horrible pandemic, in which so many of our fellow citizens are losing their lives, and oh my goodness, around the world, so many people are losing their lives. Okay? We took out $2 trillion of additional debt just in the month of April to try to already help people out, and we don't know if that will be enough. We took out $2 trillion. So we're giving to most adult Americans a check for $1,200. And there are, oh gosh, of adults, I think it's about 250 million or so, maybe 200 million that will be getting those checks. Here's how much money right now, before we add in the $2 trillion we just added to the debt. And the answer is, in the United States, we owe $24 trillion. Okay? Now we owe about 26. Right now under Trump, we're running the biggest budget deficits every year that we've ever had, and we just made it hugely worse. We, under Trump, have been spending $1 trillion more every year than we take in. Trump was really proud of a gigantic tax cut. Well, if you don't have people paying taxes and you still spend at the same rate, well, you know, if you don't pay your bills. Okay? If you keep spending more money than you have coming in, you're going to go into debt. Well, what is $24 trillion to each of us? Well, right now there's about 330 million of us in the United States. Right now, for our national debt, without adding what we just spent $2 trillion on, before that, so in February, every one of you owed $73,000. That's what it would take to pay off our debt. I owe that too. My wife owes that. So between my wife and I, we owe $146,000. That's how much debt there is. And in your lifetime, this debt's going to continue to grow. We have to pay interest on the debt. So like with your student loans, you can pay off your student loan. But if you didn't pay down the loan, at least you'd have to pay the interest. Okay? So these are huge numbers. We're talking about generating diversity and aphids. Remember aphids? Those whole aphids switching to sex? Well, what are they getting? They're getting diversity. How much diversity? More diversity than we can even imagine. That's the point. We are generating so much diversity that we'd hope that some babies out there will finally be able to make it. By the way, if you're interested in these really scary numbers, here's the website, US Debt Clock, and it keeps track of how we're running up our bills. So, 24 trillion is what we owe, and we're saying 70 trillion probably squared. So I'll let you work that out. All right. I want to do a recap here so we can remember what the heck we were talking about. Sexual reproduction, a switch to sexual reproduction. What are the costs? Well, we said the costs were finding a mate, spending energy attracting a mate, and only passing along half your genetics. That's what are extra for reproducing sexually. Okay, and we're not going to list these on the board. We've already talked about them. The bottom line is sex is expensive, and there's a million jokes here we're not going to do. Okay, just going to keep moving right on. It's just too easy. In all honesty, I like more of a challenge. Okay, so maybe a little. Where am I headed? You know, if you're going out on a date, if you got to go out and buy new clothes, try to be attractive. If you're going to look at getting married, these things are very, very expensive. Okay. So we invest in our offspring. We do that in lots of different ways. All of this is hoping that our offspring themselves will be more likely to survive and to reproduce. That's what evolution is favoring. Okay. So as we take a look at the cost for reproducing, there's a question about making lots of eggs and sperm. And there's a question about putting yolk into those eggs. Yolk itself turns out, yolk, like chicken eggs, yolk, you know, like you break a chicken egg and you have it for breakfast maybe. Yolk, if you don't know, has a tremendous amount of energy. And that means the female, the mom, has to eat extra to make all that yolk. Now, sometimes the yolk itself is sitting right there in the middle of the egg, and that's what the little embryo, about right there on the surface, is going to grow and consume. Another way to put yolk into eggs is actually to contain it in some cells. So these are cells that have a lot of yolk in them. So that's what I'm showing you there, the yolk in the cells of the actual frog embryo. So this is all what's involved in sex. So we've said then that why did aphids switch to sexual reproduction? For generating that diversity. So these are other aspects of sex and how it's expensive and additional details about sexual reproduction. And that is that parents invest a lot in their babies. Okay? They may invest a lot, by the way, by making lots of babies, or they may invest even more per baby, right? So if there's 5 kids in your family, and your parents inherited $1 million, and they want to give it to you 5 kids, okay? They could give $200,000 to each of their 5 kids. Wow. Or they could go, yeah, we're just gonna do some kind of contest, and we're going to give it all to one of the kids. Okay? So do you invest all that money or invest all your energy in just a few, or invest it in many? Now, another way to invest in your offspring and to help them survive, instead of giving them nutrients in the form of yolk, is to actually have live babies, live birth. So, don't know if you thought about this, but when a chicken lays an egg, right, you got the beginning of a little embryo there, but now it's pretty much up to that egg to get going and to use all those nutrients, and then eventually hatch out. Just curious, does anybody know how long it takes for a typical chicken egg to hatch? So once it's been laid, how long until it typically hatches? Well, if some of you were on farms, you might know that. The answer is typically 21 days. So that's exactly 3 weeks. In viviparous species, those are giving birth. Okay, so think of cats and dogs and humans. Those laying eggs, it's oviparous. That's what a chicken is doing. And what I'd like you to do, and we're not going to use cards and not working in a group, but I'd like you to think on your own and maybe pause this video and think if you can consider what are advantages of viviparous over oviparous. So giving birth to babies, being pregnant, okay, being pregnant and then giving birth to live babies, how's that somehow better than laying eggs? Okay. And I'd like you to think about these because there's big differences between them. Interestingly, in New Zealand, they have these lizards, and almost all of them are viviparous. There's only one that lays eggs, and it's found in a special situation. So in cool New Zealand, with lots of rain, viviparous has been favored in these lizards. So I don't know if you want to pause and really think. It's better for you to do that, to pause and think about this before you go on, where right now I'm going to move on and talk to you about some of the differences. Advantages and disadvantages of oviparity, that's egg laying, and viviparity, vivi, if you look up the word root, vive is live, live birth. So instead of just showing you the answers, let me ask you some additional questions. In which of these situations do we think the embryo is going to develop faster? Inside mom or inside an egg that mom has laid? Well, if she lays eggs in an environment that gets cold and warm during the day, that there's a fluctuation of temperature, that's not going to be so good as an always warm environment. Well, why? Turns out that the speed of development, a bit like chemistry, develops faster at warmer temperatures. Now, of course, that's to a limit. You don't get really hot and develop really fast, you die. But at warmer temperatures, that embryos tend to develop faster. Oh, by the way, just basic chemistry, think about dissolving a teaspoon of sugar, and you're going to try to dissolve a teaspoon of sugar in iced tea or hot tea. And in which situation is the sugar going to dissolve faster? And I hope you know that the sugar is going to dissolve faster in hot tea. And that's because the molecules are moving faster. So in a warmer environment, the embryos are developed faster. Well, in the case of New Zealand, if you lay your eggs out in a nest, it's generally a cool place. And that's where the eggs are. They're stuck. But if the embryos are inside mom, mom now can move around to different places where it's warmer, and she can try to keep the embryos and her body at a warmer temperature, warmer than as if she just laid the eggs maybe in the sand or in maybe some leaves. The next question to consider is, where do the parents invest the most energy? And this, it turns out, really depends on the situation. So mom may take all that yolk and put it in an egg, and that could be pretty close to the same amount of energy that she'd invest if she has an embryo inside her and gives birth. So sometimes parents invest more with live birth, sometimes they invest more with yolk, with laying eggs. And now the question comes along with parental care, and that's both before and after they're laying the eggs or giving birth. So I need you to think about that. Birds, fish, frogs may lay eggs, and then that's it. They never come back. And so there isn't a lot of parental care afterwards. If you give birth, mom typically hangs around and helps out a little bit and protects the young. But what about before mom lays the eggs or before mom gives birth? Let's compare those situations. Before mom lays eggs or gives birth, what are the advantages of viviparity and oviparity? Well, in both cases, mom can move around and try to avoid predators. But then once mom lays those eggs, if predators come around to the nest, there's not much that mom can do about it. She can try to create a fuss, and sometimes that helps. But if instead of laying eggs, mom keeps those embryos inside her, now she can take off with those embryos inside her and hide and bring essentially, in live birth, essentially in viviparity, she's carrying the eggs with her, right? She's carrying her little babies with her. So viviparity has another advantage over oviparity in that after the period of time that you'd lay the eggs, mom in viviparity has the embryos with her and she can retreat. Now, on the other hand, mom's pregnant. She has these little babies inside her that are growing, and that's really going to slow her down. And so now you could argue that in live birth, if she's slowed down, maybe she's a little bit more likely to be killed. And if she gets killed, all of her babies die. So if she lays eggs, maybe her little embryos and the eggs get killed, but at least she'll survive to reproduce another year. So what I'm showing you is, as you consider and compare oviparity and viviparity, it's not crystal clear which one's better. It depends on the circumstance. Okay? So let's go through a bit of a summary. Laying eggs has these advantages. Once mom lays her eggs, she's not slowed down. That's what we just said. So mom who's pregnant and pretty far along, then the babies are big inside her. That's really going to slow her down. And by the way, sometimes people say, how pregnant are you? You're either pregnant or you're not. What they mean is, how far along is the embryo? Okay, so there are not degrees of pregnancy. Okay, you either are or not. It's a bit like being dead or alive. You either are dead or you're alive. Here in oviparous, if mom dies, babies survive, or if babies die, mom can survive, right? And in oviparous species, where mom may be laying eggs that have different amounts of yolk, mom may be laying thousands of eggs that have very little yolk in each one. Okay, so now you got $1 million and you spread it around 1,000 people. So you're going to give 1,000 people $1,000. Okay, that's kind of the yolk distribution for frogs, for example, that might lay 1,000 eggs. Very little yolk or very little money per person. Although $1,000 is still a pretty good deal. Oviparous, laying eggs, what are the disadvantages? Well, we said already in New Zealand, if you lay the eggs and they're down there, it's a cool environment and it may not be a good place for the eggs to develop at all. Second, if you have live birth, mom is providing a regular amount of nutrition for the offspring, and therefore mom can be providing more nutrition to each offspring. But if you're laying eggs, it's pretty much like a sack lunch. Sort of like, well, here you go, and that's it. Now take off. I kind of like the sack lunch analogy. There's also questions of whether or not the environment will always be good for the little embryos to develop. Okay, so what if for some reason there's a poor oxygen supply? The eggs get covered up by the things they shouldn't be covered up with. Or what if they get too dry? So here we're saying risky oxygen, but they could be dried out. Okay, and so the eggs are sort of left on their own. Mom is going to be pretty fussy about where she's going to lay these eggs, but once she does, that's pretty much it. Now there are cases, it's the animal kingdom, where mom, sometimes dad, might move the eggs around after they've been laid. Okay, there are situations like that, but I'm talking about generally what's going to be happening. How about viviparous? So this is live birth. What are the advantages and the disadvantages here? Well, this is what I was arguing for. In the case of viviparity, so mom is keeping the embryos within her. Mom can keep a nice warm environment. There's going to be plenty of moisture, and so it's more stable. It's a better environment. Unlike the sack lunch, this is like staying in the kitchen. There's a continuous supply. Oxygen is up to mom, and as long as mom's getting a good oxygen supply, then the developing embryos should be just as well. And mom can retreat take the babies with her quite easily because they're inside of her. Disadvantage, we said already, babies on board slows you down. I remember when I was a kid next door, I looked in the yard of the next door neighbor, and there was a garter snake, and it was right out in the open. Went over to look at it, and it wasn't leaving. And I looked even more closely, and it was a female that was just about to give birth, because they give birth. And she could have had 20 babies inside her. And I could have walked right over and picked her up. And I could have, if I was a dog or something, I could have eaten her. And so it really was apparent that this female who was about to give birth was really in a disadvantage. She could have easily been preyed upon, and then she would have died, and all of her babies would have died. Okay, and so that's that point. There is a more limited number of offspring if you're live birth. So if we think about live birth and those things growing inside her, there's a limit really of mom's body. If you put very little yolk in the eggs, you can have thousands of eggs that you lay. And that is the case in amphibians and fish. So if we're looking at vertebrates alone, you can have more babies in oviparous situations than viviparous. All right, to kind of help you out, I've created a bit of a chart. And what we're looking at, just at the start, is how many eggs roughly have you got, how much yolk are you putting into them, or maybe it's a non-yolk, maybe it's viviparity over here, and what are our examples? And here in the millions are sponges. Sponges are releasing gametes, and there's going to be millions of eggs. They have very little to no yolk, and they toss them out, and it's sort of, go, good luck. It's like throwing candy at a parade. They just toss it out and hope that it goes and makes it to someplace. In amphibians, it's not millions, it's thousands, but as well, and in insects and fish, very, very little yolk, and so lots of eggs with little yolk, right? So you understand there's a limited amount of yolk. So if you have thousands of eggs, you're going to have very little yolk per egg. That's just like the $1 million, giving out $1 million to 1,000 kids, each kid gets $1,000. Or giving $1 million later on to just 2 kids, well, then they're going to get a lot more money per each child. So this is, again, kind of like thinking about spreading that money around, but it's spreading around the yolk. Here, if you have only hundreds of eggs, then each egg is going to have even more yolk. And again, that's the kind of variation that we see between insects, fish, and amphibians. Now we're getting around to the non-yolk. See, this is live birth situation. And so you have fewer babies, but you invest much more per baby. And as I said, typically mammals and a lot of reptiles. And then finally, there could be some birds that have very large amounts of yolk in their eggs. There may also be some nesting behavior where moms are going to help to raise the little chicks and feed them after they hatch. And so there are some reptiles, including birds, that do this. So this could be a bit of a mixture. Finally, sort of the other end of the extreme. So we got sponges over here at one end of extreme, millions of eggs, very little yolk, toss them out, good luck. And then over here, look at primates. You may have 1 or 2 babies, and it's live birth, and there's a tremendous amount of parental care. And as I like to point out, it's not true for all of you, but for some of you, your family is still a major source of support. In fact, as we've had to retreat away from the college, and many of you go home, many of you went home where parents are helping to support you right now. Well, for goodness sakes, if you're 18, 19, or 20 years old, look at how long parental care has been going on. Now, there are others of you that have been more independent and on your own sooner, and you've really had to grow up and figure some things out, and it's not been as easy maybe for you. I don't know, everybody's different. But there's a tremendous amount of parental care when we think about primates, so the great apes, including us. Moving on to some other aspects of reproductive biology. So we've been talking about vertebrates here, Now let's think a little bit about really what makes us so darn special. This is it. It isn't that we're smarter, really, than we were 20,000 years ago. It's that as we've learned things, we pass it along to the next generation. And that's the culture. That's the culture part of things. Culture is where you're passing along the ways of doing something, knowledge about something, safety, what to do under certain circumstances. Those are all aspects of culture. Dr. Campbell, who's not alive anymore, but who started your textbook, said this. Now you think about, this is a Neanderthal over here, or a Neanderthal. Neanderthal, by the way, is named for a region in Germany, and the TH sound is a T sound in German. So some people call them Neanderthals, and other people say Neanderthals. It's okay, either way. But it was a Neanderthal any less wise and intelligent than sort of the European model here of the thinker? Well, think about the situation that Neanderthals lived in. I mean, just toss yourself out in the woods. You going to be able to survive? You're going to be able to survive through the winter? So there are survivor shows where people go out, what is it, Naked and Alive or something like that, where people go out and they literally don't have any clothing and they have to make their way and not freeze to death. You have to be really smart. And what are you going to do when you got all this stuff going and you're living and you got some shelter and now something horrible happens, like a fire or a bad storm? How are you going to survive through that? And that's the bit of wisdom, the culture that gets passed down. We tend traditionally to think of older members of our species as being wiser. The reason is they've lived longer, they've been through more circumstances, and they know what to do. Now, when we think about wisdom today, it might be problem solving. So you might be on a computer, some of you may or may not be sending files, some of you need to respond to our exams using Microsoft Word documents, and so you're problem solving with technology, okay? Well, people who are living out in the wild are problem solving too. What are we going to do? So should you be making that fire before it gets dark? Yeah, why? Well, because you got to find wood and you got to find a place to camp. And what if it rains tonight? And are you in a good spot? And are we going to be safe from predators? And what are we going to do to avoid predators? All of these things require problem solving. So the point is, you might think that we're smarter than we were 200,000 years ago, but it's really that over the generations we pass information along. Traditionally, we've been doing this through books. Now we have computers and technology that allow us to transmit information and share it very, very widely. My goodness, you could come up with a new recipe for a new type of bread right here in Illinois. And tonight, someone across the world in a remote part of China who has a computer could be using your knowledge from Illinois tonight and modify their recipe and make something different. Our ability to transmit culture amongst us and between generations is greater than it ever has been before. The old knowledge is power. That's what you're here for. That's why you're in college. College is about transmitting culture, things that we've discovered. How the virus, if you want to talk about it's called SARS-CoV-2, SARS hyphen CoV hyphen 2, the number 2. That's actually the name of the virus that's causing COVID, which is the disease. Well, right now, you're getting to live through a time when we're still discovering some fundamental things. We don't know yet how to successfully treat this disease. We don't even know why certain people have really bad reactions. Yeah, it's true that older people generally seem to be getting worse, and we're starting to notice in the last week or two, we've been seeing some people noting that men seem to suffer a bit more than women. There may be some reasons there, but right now we're accumulating this information that then we hope to pass along. And my hope for us is that if we can hold tight and you guys can be safe for maybe another 4 months or so, that in about 4 months, I have a lot of hope that we will discover that some of the drugs that we're trying out now will be effective treatments. And so one of my first hopes is that in the next 3 to 4 months, we're going to discover ways to reduce the deaths. Now, people will still probably be getting sick. We might be learning some ways to reduce the chances to get sick. But those who are sick, I hope we can discover, and fairly soon, like I said, over the next 4 months, ways to treat people who aren't doing so well. That would be great, okay? And then we hope that, gosh, within a year or so, we might start having a successful vaccine that helps us to fight this disease. A lot of what we're doing to fight this disease is using knowledge about similar viruses called coronaviruses, similar viruses like SARS and the common cold. And so we're applying that knowledge. Now, that knowledge is being passed along in universities and by research papers and by technology. And the knowledge we're gaining now, we're sharing really quickly. So we have any insights. We're desperate. We're very desperate to find ways to treat and prevent the disease. And I hope that we do make some important discoveries. That's all the transmission of culture, folks. That's it. So what are we doing in parenting? We invest in our kids in many different ways. If you're a snake, you might invest. Snakes, if you don't know, reproduce both. Sometimes some species are live birth, so viviparous. Some other species are oviparous, laying eggs. So we invest differently. We talked about investing in the case of yolk, or investing with live birth by having some relationship where nutrition gets passed along from mom to the developing embryos, right? We might guard nests. And then, of course, there's all the parental care. Maybe it's a young fox who's learning from mom a little bit of what they ought to do, and what works and what doesn't work. And play sometimes. Play, when we look at play in young mammals, we actually think that there's a part there that's involved learning, trial and error, what works. All right. Now let's talk a little bit about sexual strategies. So once we look at sexually reproducing individuals, let's look at some sexual strategies. Charles Darwin. Charles Darwin was, of course, gave us natural selection, and so did Alfred Wallace. But Darwin went on to document many cases and make really the argument for natural selection. And then Charles Darwin was thinking about his ideas and applying it in other situations. For example, he took his ideas, explained in Origin of Species, and then later on applied it just to humans in a book that's called The Descent of Man. And we read parts of those in the evolution class. But one of the other things that really troubled him was to take a look at the differences between males and females, the appearance of them. And for example, the famous example is peacocks. So the flashy, elaborate feathers that we see on a male peacock versus a female peacock that isn't very colorful and kind of blends into her environment. And Darwin was trying to figure out what's that all about. And he knew that from the mechanism that he was arguing for, natural selection, that what does the selection in natural selection is the environment. And by the environment, we might mean a cold environment or a hot environment or an environment with a lot of predators or an environment that has lots of nesting, shelters, and other environments that are pretty barren. So think about a natural prairie versus a plowed field that's all around me. My wife and I were looking at that over the weekend and thinking, gosh, look at these fields. They're about to plant them, so they're very barren. And we were thinking, think about that versus a natural prairie and how diverse and lush a natural prairie is, okay? So those are environments that are favorable for life to live in or not, okay? Then Darwin suggested this. In sexual selection, what's doing the choosing is actually the opposite sex. Now there's something called parental investment theory. Parental investment theory. And parental investment theory is an argument that the sex that invests the most in the babies, is the one that's most likely to do the choosing. Okay? So if we think about humans, how much time and energy and risk does a female human face when reproducing? Well, she's pregnant for about 9 months. Then when she gives birth, especially without modern medicine available, mothers die from birth. Mothers die trying to give birth if things go wrong. And then, if a mother is going to nurse the baby, we'd hope that she nurses the baby for a couple of years, but she may nurse for only 6 months. And after 6 months, the baby's probably eating other things other than just ingesting mother's milk. So at least she's going to nurse for, let's say, 6 months, maybe a couple of years in a native environment, and then she's going to teach the children, raise them, and care for them, and defend them, protect them in all kinds of ways. What's a dad have to invest? What does a dad have to do to pass along his genetics? And the answer is, he has to engage in sex. He has to ejaculate inside of a female. That could be a matter of minutes. And that's it. The male could inseminate a female and then never see her again, and she bears her children with half of his genetics. Well, we hope that that's not the case, of course. But it highlights the difference in the sexual strategies between males and females. And so this argument of sexual investment theory is that female humans then are going to be fussier about who they're going to mate with because they have more at risk. Okay? Parental investment theory. And so there's the conclusion. So, because of this, because of females being choosier, males have an awful lot of problems. So think about this. What are males going to need to do? Well, they never want to be short of sperm when they have an opportunity to reproduce. So they're going to have to produce a lot of sperm, an awful lot of sperm. And one of the things that I studied in my PhD were salamanders. And what I found, I had salamanders that the breeding season was over. Now those salamanders normally had to reproduce in a pond, and I caught them as they were leaving the pond, and the females had already left and the males had nowhere else to go. So I knew when I caught them that they were on their way out of the pond and they weren't going to have a chance to reproduce until another year. And yet when I looked at those males, they had tremendous amounts of sperm that were left over. Wow. It was very clear that the strategy for the males of these salamanders in this pond that I studied, the strategy was to make sure you never run out of sperm. And then one of the things I looked at was, what are you going to do with that extra sperm? And so there seemed to be two hypotheses. One was, will they resorb it? So will other cells in their body sort of eat those cells? And if they do, then that helps to save some of the energy, right, that was used to make the sperm. Or the other strategy is maybe they just dump the sperm, they just toss it out. And the answer that I found through a couple experiments was that they actually just toss the sperm out. They don't even try to resorb it. Wow. Second thing that males have to do is attract a mate. And the third thing is to make sure that if he's going to be involved in raising the babies, that the babies are actually his. So a major problem for males is this, and it kind of rhymes, the certainty of paternity. How confident is a male that the female's actually giving birth to his babies? So maybe you've seen talk shows where they come on, it's a great big thing, a mother's asking maybe for child support or something, and the question is the child that was produced between, the child produced by the mom, was it actually the child of a particular guy? And so there's a big whole paternity test to see whether or not this guy is really the father, okay? Have you ever seen a test, though, to determine who's the mother? Just got to think about that. Ever a TV show in which, who's the mother? Well, in most cases, we know who the mother is. The baby came out of her. Now, there could be mix-ups in a nursery or something in a hospital. But in general, moms know if it's her kid. But dads don't. And so that has raised all sorts of cultural problems. Okay? We have paternity tests, but we don't have maternity tests. By the way, don't miss things like this. Go out and buy one of these tests, and so the test itself could be 20 or 30 bucks. And then don't miss this. Oh, by the way, when you send it in, there's going to be another $139 fee. So don't think when you buy these things off the shelf or off the internet that in fact that's going to be just it. Okay? But there's usually not a maternity test. So before we go on and consider this, let me talk to you a little bit more about the kind of ways that we see this. There's, and we'll read about this when you get to evolution, there's a study that was done in which they looked at the reasons that a couple might separate. And they said that essentially so it's a heterosexual couple, and that one of the two has cheated in some way. They're having some kind of an affair. And that person may have had sex with the other person when they're having the affair, or they simply are like texting and doing things. They haven't actually physically had sex, but they seem to become quite emotionally attached. And so the question comes up, is a woman going to be more upset if her husband or her partner is emotionally attached but didn't have sex, or if they had sex but they aren't emotionally attached? And the same thing with males. So is a male whose wife or partner has cheated in some way, is that male going to be more concerned that the female had actual physical sex, which we're meaning a sexual intercourse, the kind of sex that could lead to babies, or is the male going to be more upset if the woman kind of loves another guy but has not actually been engaged in sex? Okay, so it's the same question, but from the different perspective of the male or the female. And what we found was that in general, of course, people are different, but in general, females were more concerned that a male was emotionally connected to somebody and less concerned that they had physical sex. But that the males were the reverse. Males were much more concerned if the female had physical sex than if she was emotionally connected. So think about that. How does that have to do with the male strategy? Well, males are concerned that the females are having sex with other males, and therefore the male may be spending all this time raising somebody else's kid. Females, on the other hand, if they're relying on the males to provide resources, protection, to be involved as an important parent, helping to be a two-parent family, females are more concerned that the male gets emotionally connected and then disconnects from raising the kids. And so the female strategy, this is what's argued, the female strategy is more to keep the male in the family, and she's not so worried about him having sex somewhere as she is that he would leave because of the emotional connection. In any case, there's a lot more about this, about male strategy. But in the animal kingdom, what we find is that when we look at the genetics of birds, for example, we find that females do cheat a lot. And that in an awful lot of bird nests, we find that the babies, the hatchlings, are not all from the same father. But we also know from some research that if the female gets caught cheating, that males will abandon the nest. So, though females cheat, if they get caught, they run the risk that the male will abandon the nest, and that makes it very likely that all those little offspring in the nest will not make it. So, these roles of the parents, the sexual and the parental investment theory, really makes a difference on what the roles are of the males and females. All right, now talking about different kinds of mating ratios, males and females. When you think about this, what we're talking about to help you, monogamy is just one male and one female, okay? That's one way of creating pairing. And if you think about it, when is this most adaptive versus other situations where it's going to be one male with many females or one female with many males? We'll see both. But when you think about one male, one female, when is this most adaptive? When is this ratio paid off the most in evolution? And it seems that the answer is when it takes two parents to really raise the offspring. They may be together for a very long period of time, and the point is here, both parents are really needed to raise the young. Likewise, both parents can be teaching the offspring all kinds of information, and so even more culture can get transmitted. So think about things you learned from your mom, and think about things you learned from your dad. Now, polygamy is when there's not a one-to-one ratio. But you should know, polygamy itself could be one male and many females, or it could be one female and many males. Okay? It's multiple mates of either sex. Polygyny, poly and gyne, which means females, polygyny is one male and many females. This is probably what most people are thinking about when they're thinking about polygamy. Polygyny is one male, many females. Think of the word root here, by the way, for a gynecologist. So a female might be going to see a gynecologist, and that's why the GYN. That's what has to do with that branch of medicine. Well, in the case of one male and many females, when this seems to be adaptive, is when the male has a lot of resources or something where he can actually support many females, each with kids. Okay? So again, if you're thinking about in a human situation, let's back away from that right now and think about a male, maybe some mammals, a male mammal that's very, very strong and powerful, and that he can actually preside over sort of a harem, it's called that, a group of females, and he's really strong and powerful, and he can protect them and then watch over really multiple females that have the babies that he helped produce. Okay? But it's probably a male that somehow has tremendous resources or something else that's really important. Okay? Well, when we think about this, and I've been showing this for a long time, our current president has gone through 3 wives, and he has kids with each of his wives. And with each of these wives and kids, he is responsible for supporting them. Now, polygyny is illegal in the United States. Polygyny was going on in a certain religion that's very popular in the United States. I don't know if you know. So Mormons were doing this. And I understand that when Lincoln was president, there was a lot of discrimination against Mormons. And during that time, during Lincoln's time, is when polygyny was outlawed. Well, to have many wives at one time is illegal, but you can have many wives in sequence. And that's what our president has done. He's on his third wife, kids with each one. He had them not at the same time, right? So he had his first wife, had kids, then they get divorced. Then he has another wife, and I think he had one child. And then he gets married a third time, and they have a child right now. Barron, I think is his name. And the kids are all innocent in all this, right? They're not to be blamed, and that's why in politics, generally we leave the kids out of it. What the parents are doing is one thing, but the kids just get brought into it, and they didn't really choose that. So in any case, there's cereal, S-E-R-I-A-L, not like cornflakes, not that kind of cereal. Cereal, which means in order, polygyny, does happen in our society, where someone with a lot of wealth or social power of some sort is able in sequence to then support multiple families in order. Maybe you've known of those situations. I have a person that I went to school with. He's a very successful physician, and I think he's on his fourth wife right now. And he has, I think, kids by multiple. And so he's doing the same kind of thing, and he's paying tremendous amounts of child support. Okay? Well, this idea of many wives, a male with many wives and lots of resources, was a sign of royalty. So maybe you know the play or the movie The King and I, and it was about a king and many, many wives. One of the people that I went to school with was the grandchild of a king. And he said that his dad had many, many wives. In fact, over 50 wives. And they had all these kids. And I asked him, when you get older, would you like to have many wives? And he said no. And he said the reason was that when you have all those kids, they don't really get to know each other well, but they also don't get to know their dad. So if your dad had 50 or 100 children, how well would you know your dad? And so this very dear friend of ours who lives in Malaysia now, and he's a professor there, he was telling me that he wouldn't want to have many wives because you wouldn't get to know your kids very well. So polygyny is favoring a situation where a male has a dominance of resources that females are attracted to. Polyandry, so it's one female and many males, is a very interesting situation. Someone who's a Mormon told me that polyandry, as well as polygyny, also occurred in Mormons in the United States. And I think the situation was this. So when people moved out west during the 1800s, there was a great movement to the western sides of the United States. Most of the adventurers were males. And when they get out west, and now they're exploring and they're setting up ranches, or they're mining, or they're doing something, there were very few females. In fact, prostitution was quite popular because then one female could at least provide sexual services for all these men. More men. But the question was, when you think about then a male that wants to have a kid, what if a woman who's in short supply agrees to have kids by different males? And so the family so a woman may have 3 husbands, or at least 3 spouses that produce children with her. And so it might be a way to spread around that limited resource, which is females out west. Now, where we see this, and so it's pretty rare, where we see this in the animal kingdom is in a case where females are producing eggs, and they're producing lots of eggs, and that's what they're spending their time doing. They're going out and getting food and trying to produce as many eggs as possible. But once they have a little hatchling, they need somebody to watch over that kid. And so that little hatchling is guarded by the males. And the example is the jacana bird. Jacana birds walk around on these lily pads like this. And the little chicks are walking around the lily pads. And there are alligators. And alligators will eat these baby chicks in no time at all. And so what we need in this situation is a female who's just out eating all she can and producing as many eggs as she can. And she's going to mate with multiple males, each one who will guard chicks. And so the female becomes sort of an egg machine, and the males become the guardian of the chicks because it takes a lot of energy. Okay? So that's another unusual situation where males are actually the choosier sex. All right. And now we're going to kind of end, for the zoology side of things, on something that's really quite different. Social insects. So you have to think about, where do we find insects living in social groups? And this could be in a honey hive. It also could be in an ant colony. So beehive, honey hive, and an ant colony. So we said in sexual reproduction, typically what's going on is in the males and females are each donating half their genetics to their offspring. Okay. Bees, typically, the queen's diploid, so she's giving, on average, she's giving 50% of her genes to her workers all the time. Interestingly, the males are haploid, and they're always producing identical sperm. So this is the key part. It's the males produce identical sperm. Females are producing, they're giving off half their genetics, and they're producing variable eggs that on average have 50%. And so if you do the math on this, all of the offspring from the males, all the young produced, all of them get the same 50% from dad. The variation comes in what are you getting from mom. And so every worker bee that's produced, every one, at the minimum, is 50% related to each other. Now, if two worker bees inherited exactly the same thing from mom, then those two worker bees would be 100% interrelated. But on the other hand, if those two worker bees inherited the exact opposite 50% from mom, then those two worker bees would be only 50% interrelated because they'd share all of dad's stuff. So at one extreme, you could be 100% interrelated, or at the other extreme, 50% interrelated, and the average of 50 and 100 is 75. So, this is the really interesting thing. Worker bees, if they reproduce sexually, would pass along only half of their genetics. But if worker bees help mom to reproduce, they actually pass along, on average, 75% of their genetics. So why would worker bees, in these situations, help the queen bee to reproduce, and the worker bees don't reproduce at all? And the answer seems to be that by helping mom to reproduce, you're actually passing along more of your genetics than if you reproduced by yourself. Isn't that interesting? So there's the question. That's what we just answered. Will worker bees pass along more of their genetics if they reproduce sexually, or instead, if they never reproduce, they just help mom to reproduce? So there's a worker bee. So the drone gives identical genes. So these two worker bees are going to be at least 50% interrelated. The question is, what are they getting from mom? And here, they're getting the exact same things, and so the worker bees are going to be 100% interrelated. But here, if there's variation, what they're getting, they may be only 50% interrelated, and we said the average is 75. And so worker bees on average are 75% interrelated, and therefore worker bees pass along more of their genes, not by reproducing, but by helping mom to reproduce, So, in reality, there are all kinds of variations of this. That was the simple explanation for social insects. But when we get involved, we see that there are, for example, females that reproduce with multiple drones. So the bees wouldn't necessarily be 75% interrelated, and there's all sorts of other exceptions that we just don't have time to explore. That's pretty much, guys, what I have planned for you to talk about for reproductive biology. I hope you haven't tried to listen to this lecture all at once, because it's already over 100 minutes long. My goodness. It usually takes us a couple weeks to do all of this. What I want to do is invite you to ask questions of me. Now you can email them to me, and of course it'll have your address. And I'm promising you that I will not associate your name or your identity with any questions. And what I will do, if you email me, let's say by the end of April, if you email me by the end of April, I'll try to answer whatever questions I can, and I'll post answers on another PowerPoint that I'll post here later. So I'd like to try to give you a chance to ask questions. But I wanted to show you, for fun, one of the questions. So the questions don't always have to be the details of sex, although a lot of students want to get good information and ask me some things, maybe about how to get pregnant or something, or how not to get pregnant. And so there's lots of students that have these kinds of questions. But here was a question a student had. So you can read the question. So I bring this up just because it's a fun way to review a little bit of what we looked at. Here's the amazing thing. This wasn't a hypothetical. It actually happened. So here are identical twin males who married identical twin females. What is the relationship amongst their kids? Well, think about it this way. If this male, this brother right here, had a baby with this woman or a baby with this woman, he's passing along all of his same genetics. And regardless of which woman he reproduces with, she's going to pass along the same genetics. These two women are like one person reproducing. So the kids that he has with this woman, or if he had kids with this woman, would be full brothers and sisters. And likewise, this dad with either woman, or this woman right with either guy, all of this. So the answer is all of these kids are full brothers and sisters. So if this is husband, wife, and let's just say this is their 3 kids, they are full brothers and sisters with these other kids. And I guess one of these is identical twin boys. So what are the genetic relationships between the dads? These 2 guys, well, they're like clones. So we started all of this with aphids, seems like years ago. The question about aphids was asexual reproduction or sexual reproduction. This would be like asexual reproduction. These 2 are clones of each other. These 2 are clones of each other. Okay. What's the relationship between the moms? 100%. Relationship with dads? 100%. except for any mutations that have arisen in their lifetimes. What's the relationship between the parents and their kids? Well, we said each parent is 50% related on average to their, well, they are 50% related to their kids. Their kids are 50% related to each other. Dad's 50% related to the kids. Mom's 50% related to the kids. Okay? So the relationship here is 50% to your kids. And then normally, the relationship, if these two dads were not identical twins, if they were just regular brothers, then the relationship between this guy and his brother's kids, so he's an uncle, would be 1/4. That would normally be the case. But because these two have the same genetics, his relationship to his brother's kids is the same as his brother to his own kids. Okay. So we're going to end the semester. The next thing that I'll post will be after your questions. I'll give you all the way to the end of April to ask some questions of me. I'm going to, as I'm saying right here, I'm going to hold things in confidentiality. I guess I'm supposed to be and or, but confidentially. You can ask about whatever you want. It could be other zoology questions. I'm not promising that I'll answer everything, but I am promising that I will hold your confidentiality. You want to email these? I'd like you to email these for me to consider them by the end of April, and then I'll develop another PowerPoint where I'm trying to pose the questions. I might reword the question a little bit, and then I'll do my best to answer them. Okay? So always email me in case you need anything clarified. All right. I think that's it.